Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest edition of Let's Talk Mediterranean, the Mediterranean Seminar's occasional podcast. I am Brian Catlos, and together with Sharon Kinoshita, I co-direct Mediterranean Seminar. Today, our guest is Kristina Richardson, who is Associate Professor of History at the CUNY Graduate Center and Queen's College, and the author of Difference and Disability in the Medieval Islamic World, which came out in 2018 with Edinburgh University Press, and soon to come out with IB Tauris and Bloomsbury, Roma in the Medieval Islamic World. She's here today to talk about tracing a Gypsy mixed language through medieval and early modern Arabic and Persian literature, an article which she published in Der Islam in 2017, and which is the Mediterranean Seminar's article of the month for June of this year. So let me say welcome, Kristina, and I'll pass the microphone over to Sharon Kinoshita. And let me just say before I do that, my apologies in advance if the audio is not so clear this time around, but we're spread out over essentially half of the world from Barcelona to the West Coast. So you'll have to bear with us if it's not always clear. So over to you, Sharon.
Well, welcome, Kristina, and we're really excited about the chance to talk about your article, Tracing a Gypsy Mixed Language Through Medieval and Early Modern Arabic and Persian Literature. And I was really just blown away and fascinated by the interdisciplinarity of your article. So I would love for you to talk a little bit about your background, your research interests, and how you came to them.
Thank you, Brian and Sharon, for having me. Well, and thank you for the compliments on the article. How I came to this topic was really serendipity. So actually just a few weeks ago, an Arabic edition that I completed with Boris Liebrands of Leipzig, Germany, just was published in Beirut. So this was, we together edited and wrote a study of a 16th century Syrian silk weaver's notebook. And he was living in Aleppo, right? And the notebook covers the years 1589 and 90. And he wrote about walking down the street and listening to a musician and a singer singing in 7 languages. And one of the languages happened to be the language I trace actually in this article. So it was, even when I came across this in the manuscript, it was confusing and confounding. And it took about a month to actually figure out what he was referring to, because it's not a language that is actually mentioned in anything I had read in the past 20 years, right? In studying Islamic history. So that's how I came to this. It was really an accident.
Well, that's great. What is it? Yeah, sorry. What does you tell us a little bit about your academic formation and where you studied and how you got into this?
That's a great question. Well, I'm from Detroit, Michigan, so it's a home. I don't know if you've ever been, but anyway, so it's a predominantly Black city, but it also has a very substantial Middle Eastern component. Yemeni shop workers, shop owners, and Chaldeans and Palestinians. So this was basically this is where I'm from. So this is very familiar. So when I went off to college at Princeton University, there was a little bit of culture shock. And I think to ground myself a little bit, I started taking I took a Middle Eastern history course, and then I took first semester of Arabic just to go home and maybe surprise my friends with some Arabic phrases. So this was, again, a silly, a bit of a silly undertaking, but that led to, right, my life's work. So while I was there, I did spend a year in Paris at INALCO studying classical Arabic. And then I got my PhD at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. And directly from there, in 2008, I started working in New York City. So I've been here for 13 years working. But in all of the time that I've been studying and working, I will have to say that I have, and I think this annoys my students, I'm really not interested in kings and queens and sultans and courts like this, right? I'm not interested in the highest levels of Islamic society. So I've always been interested in people who were either alienated from the majority or just on the margins of society somehow. So that's been a current throughout my work, whether it's blue-eyed people, right, who are vilified in Islamic historiography, or disabled people, or now Roma-like peoples. That's basically shaped my entire body of work.
Well, that's fascinating. And the thing about doing medieval early modern history about people who aren't kings and queens and sultans is the problem of the archive, right? And how do you uncover
Mhm.
traces of these people? So maybe that's a good segue into your article. If you could kind of give us an overview of what you uncover and the kind of pieces of the mosaic that you have to painstakingly
Mhm.
assemble in order to present the picture and the analysis that you do. And yeah, can you give us an overview of both the content and the process?
Sure, absolutely. So, I mean, in terms of the substance of the article, it's really looking at something, and I'll just use the English terms. So something that was named in the 16th century manuscript as the language of the strangers. Um, Through research, it became clear that the word strangers was actually a name that a group of itinerant beggars and entertainers and so-called tricksters called themselves by the late 1100s. They were called the sons of Sasan at first, and then they decided to call themselves strangers, giving a sense of, right, their estrangement from, again, majority society. So what I was able to do in this article was, well, this was the beginning, to reconstruct some of the basics of the grammar and of the vocabulary, and it gives a pretty amazing insight into their culture. Um, so what I was able to, but maybe to get into a little bit about method, Sharon, as you were asking, it did require lifting some disciplinary boundaries, which I wasn't able to. I mean, looking back on this article that I published 4 years ago, I can see where I was still kind of trapped by the modern episteme, right? Some of these categories I couldn't lift myself out of. Um, but what I was able to do was, move past this idea of language family, right? Because this language they spoke does not perfectly descend, right, from either Semitic or Indo-European languages. And because of that, past scholars have tended to characterize this language as a so-called secret language, which really represents their own perspective, right? They're unfamiliar with it. And so they ascribe all kinds of negative and nefarious, intent on its speakers, if they're using it to hide from the majority, which is something you could say about any language, right? I don't speak Spanish, Brian. So if I'm in Spain, everything feels like a secret language to me, right? But it's so this is the perspective that I had to break out of, and to see that this was a mixed language, right? So the grammar is Arabic, but the vocabulary is mixed, and it's comes from Akkadian and Arabic, Persian, Greek, even a few Greek terms and Latin terms are in there. So to kind of shows, one, it probably was an ancient language, but it also shows so much, and also Aramaic, I should have said that, also so much influence from the peoples of the Middle East, that was kind of, that was very intriguing. So again, so I had to break down language family, the secret language idea, and imperfectly in this article, I tried to get beyond ethnic identifications. I don't think I did that so well, but in in hindsight, I can see what I should have done. Instead of trying to ascribe an ethnic identity, just describe them as a community of like-minded and elective people.
Wow, I mean, this is so fascinating. I think one of the reasons that we were all so taken by your article is that in so many ways it kind of speaks to the heart of what we are trying to do, at least what we're trying to do with the Mediterranean seminar, is in terms not only of Mediterranean studies, but of history in general, which is, getting beyond these established paradigms of identity, language, and culture, which are so, on some levels, are so compelling, but are really so distorting because they remove, they purge history of its, the ambiguities and the uncertainties and these sort of, I don't even want to say marginal. I want to say peoples and communities that engage simultaneously in multiplicities of identities without that being seen as contradictory. So, this is one of the reasons why we found it so interesting. And I wanted to ask you, you commented yourself on your interest in marginal groups, which I could see in your work and which is fascinating. But, thinking of, the Romani community, if you want to call them that, and their place in Middle Eastern, Islamic, and later in European history. What sorts of similarities and differences can we see, for example, with other similar or related, conceptually related trans-regional pre-modern Mediterranean minorities, for example, Jews, Armenians, Berbers, even sub-Saharan Africans? What can we learn from the methodologies that you've deployed in terms of the Romani to enrich our picture of this complex world?
A really great set of questions. Maybe to start to answer that, maybe I want to just start with an analogy I use actually in some of my classes with the group that I looked at. These strangers are most comparable to the Irish travelers. And I don't know how much work either of you have done on the Irish, or your interest in them, but they are ethnic Irish peoples who split off from the sedentary Irish population. And geneticists think it was 40 generations ago or 1,200 years ago. And they split off and became nomadic. So very little attention has been paid to this transformation. And it kind of goes against our understanding of so-called civilizational progress, right? These sedentary people moved into nomadism and then created their own language, right? They speak Shelta, which is a mix of Gaelic and Irish and English and some Romani now. But they're actually analogous to the strangers I look at, who also seem to be an indigenous group that split off at an undetermined time, maybe roughly 46 generations ago as well. These are the earlier sources we have for them. And they were semi-nomadic. I don't think they were quite as nomadic as the travelers, but you see, but it was an indigenous group that split off and developed its own culture. So how do I so what kind of methodologies am I using to actually approach these peoples? I think for me, the most useful methodology has actually been with Jewish history, with historians of at least medieval Jews in the Islamic world, let's say that, because there are the similarities of this language that is maintained over generations. So the language I investigate in this article is still spoken today, I should say that, in Cairo and in the Sudan. So a group that may have had its own system of laws, whether or not these were just ritual or fully, ritual, and maybe a criminal code is not so clear yet, that they did prize the separation from the majority group out of an understanding of, preservation of culture, preservation of language, and also, as we see with professions, right? So there were certain professions that were shared within the stranger community. Say animal training was a big one. Of course, forms of begging, which is often not seen as a profession, but it was quite professional, and it had a lot of advantages, right? They didn't pay taxes on the money they had. Everything they earned was clear profit. They didn't have to borrow the money, so they didn't pay interest on this, right? So there were a lot of benefits to begging, and they really made this, and they write about it. So this is not me extrapolating. They really wrote a lot about this, about how they were able to do it. So although it seems counterintuitive, yes, I would say actually the ways in which, say, historians of medieval Judaism have looked beyond the archive, because there is not much of a state archive in the Islamic world, looking at the Geniza documents, in my case, looking at the notebook of a weaver, right, of someone, again, who literally lived on the margins of Aleppo, like lived on the edge, even said from where he lived, he could see the wilderness, right? So it was a literal status. So trying to go to these types of sources and reading them along with things that we tend not to read with them, for instance, the material culture. So I think I may have gestured towards this 4 years ago, but the strangers were actually the first peoples to print in the Middle East, and they've been printing since the 10th century. So I was able to look at their prints, right, along with the language that was preserved in their literature. So it was, I'm not looking very much at all at state archives because they're not there, right? And also looking at topographies. So they left their names on the landscape, right? So there are quarters for the strangers and there are cemeteries for the strangers. And I was able to tease out a lot of this in the intervening years. So.
Wow. Let me just quickly follow up before Sharon jumps in again. Something you said I thought was really interesting in that, we usually think of these marginal groups as lacking in agency and being sort of pushed to the sides. But really what you're suggesting, and, to a certain extent, I've seen this in my own work looking at Muslim minorities under Christian rule, is that this may be a misleading assumption in the sense that, what you're describing are individuals and groups that are, employing their agency to essentially make, kind of rational decisions, regarding strategies for survival, which just happen to take them out of the system because for whatever reason, whether it's because of their ethnicity or race or religion or some other reason, they can't fully succeed or be incorporated within that system. And I think that's a pretty interesting turn to take.
No, thanks. I mean, I think there's more for even, because I can't really call them an ethnicity. I think they describe themselves as, various groups of people in the Middle East. There may have been a core of people, right? Maybe there was a hierarchy, and maybe at the highest there was an ethnicity that was valued above others. But it was also a place where, say, fugitive slaves, right, could find respite, right, and could also be left alone from the rest of society, right? Because there was not a lot of intervention in the lives of the strangers. There was a sense that, that they didn't share the values. I know that sounds pretty obvious. And they may have lived in extreme poverty too in a lot of situations. And they also often lived beyond the city walls, so in this unprotected part of the medieval city. So they were sort of a refuge. So I'm also in a future project, in a current project, I'm looking at how maybe fugitive slave populations might have sought refuge with them, and learned more about these kind of hidden groups as well. So yeah, I think there's a lot of potential there for really understanding the dynamics and the logics of people who weren't at the center of power, right? With the begging or with also with the printing, right? This is a very portable art and very cheap to produce, right? You can mass produce hundreds of these prints and sell them, which is what they would do. And again, make pretty easy money. You just need one block, right, of wood, and you could just carry it with you and do this in any number of cities. So they're very smart, very imaginative.
One of the things that most fascinated me was the way that your community is visible in literary texts. And, I'm not an Arabist, but I've heard of these texts in different contexts, but never related to this group of strangers. So, more famously, the Maqamat you mentioned in Abu Zaid as a stranger, but then also these shadow plays, which were, fairly recently translated into English, so that, I was hungry to know more about that, but then stunned to realize that there was this connection between these kinds of middling genre of Arabic literature that have been maybe late to be discovered because they don't fit the classical canons.
I think you're absolutely right. Even, there are portions of these texts that you've mentioned, the shadow plays from Cairo, the maqamats composed in Iraq and southern Iran, right, that are not seen as, they're very well known, but they don't, they seem rather informal. But there are portions, for instance, of the shadow play that are written completely, right, in the language of these strangers. But how it has been interpreted is as though it's corrupted Arabic, right? So there's not even there hasn't been a sense. There have been a number, I think I have them in the article, a couple of German 19th century scholars who recognized that, the manuscripts, because there are at least 4 of them that they were working with, were not corrupted. They were all writing the same thing. These are all probably native Arabic speakers. So there must be something else going on. So they left the text intact when they edited it. But you do find with the number of translations or studies that they do try to shift it to make it legible to an Arab. But in fact, so there, in that way, basically obscure this very important part of stranger history, which was an essential part of their history, was their literacy. And so this is something that's one of the subtitles of my new book, Literacy, Culture, and Migration, is that they really had a very developed literary culture, oral and written and printed, right? So you had ways in which we never have, probably myself included, conceptualized these groups as maybe being the engines of a very specific type of literacy, also inspiring, right, the maqamat that are inspired by these strangers, as being witty and well spoken, right? So at the center of Arabic literature, you actually do find really these strangers right there. So yeah, marginal may not be the word, but that's how they want it to be. They want it to be estranged.
Well, I guess,
Yeah,
I mean, for me, working on medieval Europe, it's like vernacular genre, right? Literally. So that's fascinating.
yeah, it's somewhat frustrating to think that really what we're left with, both in the formal archive and in terms of formal recorded literature, is really only the tip of the iceberg, isn't it? And it's the tip of the iceberg that may not closely resemble that massive base when we think of not only of typically what we think of as oral literature, but if we also incorporate things such as music, dance, and theater, there just seems to be so much that we have to somehow try to extrapolate. And how do we do that? Is it useful, or is it ahistorical to look at I hope this doesn't sound the way I don't want it to sound, but to look at societies that we feel might resemble those societies in some way. Like, I'm thinking, for example, is it useful to look at, say, modern South Asian society to see how some of these different groups interact or claim their space in society, and how they how their culture manifests itself, or is that too risky in terms of a methodology?
That's an interesting question, because well, I probably just don't have the background in South Asian history to be able to do that. And I'm sure that would give, especially because we do know, right, by the 8th century that there were forcible migrations, or captures of Sinti, and today would be modern day Pakistan, but peoples from this region into, say, southern Iraq. And knowing the history of medieval, at least South Asia, would probably help me in understanding more about those groups, about whom I speak more in my book. But I would say that I actually believe there is enough information about the strangers to actually, I mean, that they've left, most of the writings, obviously, that I've used are authored by strangers. I think there's enough there to at least do more than what I've been able to do, right? As you mentioned, Brian, there's music and dance and to pursue. I didn't do that intentionally because I felt that might have been what that's kind of dominated the field of Romani studies, and their literacy has really been basically unassumed. So I worked there. So I think there's far more to do. And even maybe if I could segue to European history a little bit, I mean, when the Roma entered into Central Europe in the early 1400s, it seems that moment could be more explored as well. And I don't even think you would need to refer to South Asian history to get to that. So in the last chapter of my book, and I know this is going beyond the article, but I do look at this moment in which these groups that we know are printing in the Middle East were entering into Southern Germany at the same moment that block printing was arising in on paper, because block printing on textiles was also happening. But so it was the exact same moment these things were coming together. So we even know the path the Roma took into what is today Southern Germany, into Constance, and the moment in which these Bavarian monasteries were actually creating and distributing among themselves block prints. So I think there's something there that could be looked at, even without looking at India. I think there are ways in which we could still investigate maybe these encounters and these influences, even without all of that. There really is a lot there already.
Well, that's a great segue into the next question I had, which had to do with the relationship between the history of this community in Islamicate lands and the history and culture of Romany in Christendom. You know, what little I know about Romany, it seems that one of the sort of hallmarks of the of their community is this ability to, and I don't know how deep it is and how superficial it is, but to acculturate, you know, to the religious and you know, kind of ethno-linguistic mores of the communities that they find themselves within. So by the time, for example, we get to southern Spain, obviously there's, you know, in Romany culture there's a very strong Islamicate element, although I don't know if that was picked up as a consequence of contact with Moriscos rather than to what extent it was carried there by them. And so how do you see a continuity, or how do you see continuities between this group that you're looking at more in the Middle East and the sort of larger and later movements of Romany or related groups into Christendom?
Well, I guess I would start with the professional continuities. I mean, that there seems to be, well, first, let me say one thing. I think one argument that, again, is not in the article, but is in the book, is that astrology may have functioned as a religion for the strangers in the Middle East. So what we would call fortune telling or palmistry, right? These and other things as well. So I also look at books that they produced about astrology. So it seems not to have just been like a pastime on the street, although it could be perceived as such, but it might also have been their structuring kind of philosophy. I don't know if we would call it a religion. I don't know if it had necessarily the metaphysical underpinnings that moderns might call a religion. I don't know if it's considered a cult. I'm sorry, I'm just not a religious studies scholar, but this might have been their structuring ideology. And as well, we find these descriptions of, you know, this Romany propensity for astrology and fortune telling, even in the earliest sources. And although that might sound a little weak, the earliest attestation of Romany actually in Europe comes in around 1515. A monk, a southern German monk, is actually recording this language, and it's in a manuscript in Munich. And he actually records mostly astrological terms, and they may not seem so interesting, but when he's actually recording terms from his Turkic, who speak Kuman, I don't know if this language is well known, but when he records those, he's recording actually, you know, Christian prayers in these other languages. So it seems that the Romany person he spoke with was more conversant in saying astrology. Okay, so there's that continuity that, again, I do think is has something to do with their worldview, their cosmology. But then there are also these economic niches, again, that allow them not to have to integrate too much with the majority community by choice, right? A lot of this is by choice. So animal training, right? And living with the animals, you have to train the bears and the monkeys and the cats and the whatever you're training, also keeps you separated from society. Other economic niches, like printing in the Middle East, that was pretty, but they were the only ones doing it. So that was a niche there. Begging as well. I guess you could see how they are able to structure their estrangement through specific crafts and through specific professions. And I guess I would say that is the most, that's been the most resonant across, you know, geographies. And if you look at the spaces where they lived, again, always outside of the city, their burial grounds next to their portion of the city. Yeah. So they style themselves that way. I don't know if that gets to your question so much, but.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I can't resist just jumping in because I think astrology is just another one of these, you know, strands that runs through the culture of the larger West. I mean, the West that stretches from the Indus to the Atlantic, and, you know, from sub-Saharan Africa up to the Baltic, that has been, you know, really, obviously people have worked on it, but I think it suffers from this sort of post-Enlightenment prejudice against it as being unscientific, and when really it was of such paramount importance, and of course regarded as not only as a kind of spiritual or metaphysical exercise, but also as a scientific method during that period. And And it's interesting for me because what you're describing here, it really kind of it fits well with the sort of, I've been thinking for many years and trying to develop a model looking at how different ethno-religious communities interact with each other within diverse societies. And one of the sort of elements of this model I've been developing is this notion that it's often the cachet that a community, an outside community has in performing certain tasks or jobs that are seen as necessary, but for whatever reason are not really the purvey of the majority group, that sort of helps to sustain diversity, which is not to say necessarily nice relations or amicable relations, but this is kind of what holds us together. And so it's interesting to see if I understand what you're describing, I can almost imagine as much of as the Roma being venturing westward, kind of being pulled westward by the opportunities that are now arising in a more complex Europe, which before then might not have had a space for them just because the Christendom was kind of behind things. You know what I'm saying? But anyways, now I'm blabbing away, so I'm gonna pass them. Unless you want to comment on that, I'm gonna hand things back to Sharon.
I'll make a quick comment just about the scientific, right, the science of astrology, and also one part of their scientific life I didn't emphasize, again, would not be in the article, but is that what are also termed as tricks, right? This is another sort of disciplinary boundary that I had to move beyond. Instead of categorizing it as tricks, it actually turned, a lot of what they did were really scientific innovations, right? So writing in invisible ink, and then, having lemon juice or something, revealing it, right? This was often derided in majority Arabic sources as, the tricks of these people, but they actually explain it. They have long manuals, right? I have a very thick one translated in English recently, a very thick one of their, just the tricks they did, but were really the ways in which they were able to use chemicals or to use, all kinds of things to maybe just, to have paper float, right, without an evident wind, all kinds of funny things. So there is that. Right. So these aspects, sort of lay science, are actually also evident in their sources and in their writings. But yeah.
Well, fantastic. This is such fascinating material. Probably a good time for us to start to wrap up, but I wonder if you could talk to us about your current and future research.
Okay, sure. Well, I've just started writing another book that I'm tentatively calling Black Basra, which is actually inspired by a line from Ibn Khaldun, right? A North African, I think everyone knows him in the medieval world, but a North African thinker and historian. And he actually writes that for him, the Black nations of the world are located in, as we would expect, maybe as a modern, Anglophone society, in sub-Saharan Africa and Saharan Africa, so the Sahel and Sahara, and also in India, he says, but also in the city of Basra. And this characterization of Basra struck me, right, this port city in southern Iraq, because I never heard it described as such. But looking into it, and I want to write a history of it from the 7th to 10th centuries, focusing on its Black, and he defines Black, again, as Indian and African, right? So these enslaved and some free workers as well, who had been brought into the city basically to build up the city, right? It was a city founded, it's built as the first Islamic city built by Muslims by themselves. So this is in the year 637. So they needed massive amounts, and they had tens of thousands of Black laborers to build up the city that actually has a very rich literary, right? The maqamat were, the Hariri's maqamat were composed there. Hadith specialists, I can't, just forget, but mysticism was also sort of founded in Basra. So this massive cultural achievement was undergirded by the work, again, of tens of thousands of Indian, what we call Indian and African laborers in the past, but we're just called Black laborers, right, in the past. So that's my project. And looking at their uprisings, the slave trade, and just how people found models of dignified living, right, in a society that at that period, right, 7th to 10th centuries did not have such, they have so many models of such, but it's surprising. They found a lot. So that's it.
Well, that's that sounds fantastic. This has been really a lot of fun, and I think we could probably go on for a long time, particularly if we were together and there were beverages involved. But here we are on Zoom, and we're doing a podcast, so we should probably call it a day. But let's hope that we can all continue these conversations in person at some time in the future. Again, this was Let's Talk Mediterranean with myself, Brian Catlos, and Sharon Kinoshita, and our guest here, Kristina Richardson. Thanks so much for joining us today, Kristina. Again, your article was fantastic, and really looking forward to reading your work in the future.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me. This has really been a pleasure. Great.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.